Hey guys, we are lined up for one of my favorite units. We kind of got a jump start on it a week ago, and we're going to be talking about musical instruments for the next 4 or 5 weeks. So we're going to kind of focus on musical instruments that we would find in the orchestra. And if you're not sure what an orchestra is, it's kind of like a big band, giant band. You could have upwards of 50, 60, depending on the size of it, because a lot of times orchestras play in a certain city. Fall River has an orchestra, New Bedford has an orchestra, cities like Boston and New York City have an orchestra. And the bigger the city, the more people play in it. You could have upwards of 100 people all trying to play together, okay? And not only is it a big band, but it is also a fancy band. They mostly play the type of music from some of the older composers, or as Mrs. Hart sometimes likes to call them, the rock stars of the past. People we've learned about in class, like Beethoven, like Mozart. So a lot of the instruments that we see in the orchestra are kind of older instruments that have been around a long time. Okay? So what I have for you here, this is basically what the stage an orchestra plays on would look like if you were up on the ceiling looking down at it. So right here is where you would be sitting as the audience, okay? And then if you can see it, there is this little circle right here with a C. That is the conductor. And we have all learned a little bit about conducting. Conductor is the person who kind of holds everything together. Whether you have a class of kindergartners, 5th graders, or musicians who are some of the best players in the world, you're going to need somebody to tell them when it's time to begin. 100 people can't all, guess when they should start playing. So the conductor kind of keeps everybody together, tells them when to change volume, when to change speed, all that good stuff. The rest of the orchestra is set up in sections, and we talked a little bit last week about the different families of instruments. And we call them families because the instruments that go in each family are going to have things in common, just like you would find with your own family. So the family we're going to go on about today is going to be right up front, and it takes up the biggest chunk of the orchestra. This is the string family, and we're going to talk about the 5 members of the string family. There is the harp, there is the violin, viola, cello, and the bass, okay? Quick refresher on the other ones that we're going to be looking at in the coming weeks. Behind the strings, we have the woodwind family. Those are instruments that are usually made of wood, but not always, and they need air for you to be able to play them. Behind that is the brass. That's another family. These instruments are all made of metal, and they use air as well. And then in the back, and kind of taking up a lot of room, is the percussion section. Percussion is usually things that we hit, drums and things like that, xylophones. If you have played it in class, if it came to you on a cart to your classroom, then it's almost certainly a percussion instrument. That's the instrument, the type of instrument that we have the most experience with playing with in our classrooms. Okay? So back to the string family. It's the biggest section, and it's right up front because they're actually kind of the quietest instruments. The reason that we set everything up like this is because back when the orchestra was set up, long time ago, we're talking hundreds of years ago, we couldn't put microphones in front of them because there were no microphones. There was no way to amplify the sound, so we had to put the quietest instruments up front, and we had to put more of them, and we had to put the louder instruments in the back. That's why brass is all the way back there, because an instrument like the trumpet is wicked loud, okay? So strings are mostly made up of violins. We might have the harp right around here, and usually an orchestra will have 1, maybe 2 if it's a really big orchestra. Smaller orchestras might not even have any, okay? This huge section all the way on the left, that's where the violins sit, and in a big orchestra, you could have 40 or more violins. They're a really common instrument in the orchestra. Violas sit right next door, and you may not know what a viola is, but we'll talk about that. Cellos sit over here, and basses are over on the other side. And as we go from left to right, violins, violas, cellos, and basses, the number of instruments that we see representing each one of those members of the string family becomes less and less. Like I said, we could have 40 violins. We might have less than 10 basses. In a small orchestra, you might only have like 4 or 5, okay? So let's look at some instruments. Even though it is not technically part of the the orchestral string family, obviously guitar is a string instrument, and I wanted to start with this one because it's the one that you guys know the best already, okay? All string instruments are going to be made up of pretty much the same parts. This part right here is the body of the instrument. It's what helps it make enough sound that you can actually hear it. Without the body, you'd get a really super soft sound. But because the sound travels around, bounces around inside the body and comes back at you, we get enough sound to work with, okay? We also have the neck of the instrument. This is where we push down on the strings to change the pitch. We have the head of the instrument. Basically, the head is just a place for the tuners to be, okay? A lot of people are going to want to call these ears. I don't know anybody who has 6 ears. Tuners also represent the number of strings, and if you look closely, you can, of course, see the strings on this instrument. It would be awfully tough to have a string instrument that didn't have any strings, okay? All of these families have their names for a reason, and we can't get a string instrument just by tying a piece of yarn onto something. It doesn't quite work like that. The strings have to be the part of the instrument that makes the sound, okay? And the way they do that is by this part. The last part I'm going to have you learn about. This is called the bridge, okay? So we learned about the body, the neck, the head, the tuners. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on this guitar, and the bridge. And what the bridge does is it holds up the strings. Now, you may not have ever noticed unless you got a close look at one of these, but the strings are not touching the neck of the guitar. They have to float there, and that happens all the way to the head. Thing is, if the strings were sitting on that neck, they wouldn't be able to vibrate. That means that they wouldn't be able to shake back and forth super quickly, which is where our sound comes from. And your guitar, or whatever string instrument, would sound like that. And it's not a horrible sound, but it's definitely not quite as interesting as some of the other sounds that we can make on guitar, okay? So once the strings vibrate, the vibration goes into the bridge, bounces around the body, comes back at you nice and loud. Before you start playing your string instrument, every string has to be tightened or sometimes loosened, and that's where these tuners come into play, okay? When I turn one, if I turn it clockwise, it's going to loosen the string. If I turn it counterclockwise, the other way, it's going to tighten the string, okay? And before I pick up my guitar, before I head off to your class, I have to make sure that each string is tuned to a certain letter. E, B, G, D, A, E, okay? If that's right, if I make sure they're all making the correct sound, then I'm able to come into your class and play things with you. If I don't check that, if even one string comes out of tune, if I grab a tuner and I just give it a twist, let's try that same exact thing. Not pretty, not at all, okay? Because this string is too loose. And if I keep loosening it just for fun, it keeps going lower and lower and lower until it's kind of too floppy, and that's definitely not what a string should look like. So now I've got to turn it the other way and I've got to tighten it. And if we're on track, it's back, okay? Now, the other thing I want to talk about before I get to a string instrument that you may not be as familiar with is what the left hand is doing here, okay? My strings are vibrating from the head right here, from the beginning of the head, all the way to the bridge of the instrument. And this is about a little more than 2 feet. From here to here, it's a little more than 2 feet. And one thing that we're going to keep coming back to when we study our instruments is that the bigger an instrument is, the lower the sound it's going to make, okay? The smaller an instrument is, the higher the sound it's going to make. And that's not just true of instruments themselves, but it's true of parts of instruments as well. If we look close up at the strings, you can see that top string is much bigger than the bottom string. And because of that, this top string makes a low sound. The bottom string makes a really high sound, okay? Now, when we have the string able to vibrate that whole 2 feet of length, then it's going to make kind of a lowish sound. What we do to change that is we cut the string, not literally because that would break the instrument, but we're going to push down between these metal lines here. These are called frets, and they help guitarists figure out where exactly to put their fingers to get different sounds, okay? Now, if I put my finger right here, right up next to the head, I've made that string like that much shorter, okay? But it's going to change the sound. Listen. There it is, open, when I'm vibrating the whole 2 feet. And there it is, a teeny tiny bit higher. But here's the thing. The closer I move my hand towards the bridge of the instrument, the higher that sound is going to go. Check it out. Until I run out of string, basically, until I'm hand is falling in the resonating chamber, that big hole right there where the sound comes out of. And if we start on a higher string, higher we go, the higher the sound we get. So we can go all the way from that super low sound to that super high sound. That's why guitar is such a cool instrument, because it can handle so many different pitches. All right, so the instruments of the orchestra. Harp I don't have for you because harp is a gigantic instrument. It would probably take up most of the room I'm in right now, and I'm also on a second floor. I'd never be able to get it up the stairs. Not only that, but it's a super duper expensive instrument. That's why a lot of smaller orchestras don't even have one, okay? So the first instrument we're gonna look at that does pop up is the violin, okay? Now, violin is an instrument you're all familiar with, at least by the looks of it, but you may think I don't know much about it. Thing is that just from sitting through the first 12 minutes of this video, you do, because it has some of the same parts as that guitar, okay? Check it out. I bet you can tell me what this part of the instrument is called. Even though it doesn't look exactly like the body of the guitar, it does the same thing. It's the biggest part, and this is where the vibration is going to go into and come back at you loud enough that you can hear it all, okay? We have the strings, we have the neck of the guitar, we have the head. This is called the scroll. It does absolutely nothing, just makes the instrument look a bit fancier. And then we have the tuners. And you might notice that there are less tuners on a violin than there are on a guitar because there are less strings. We don't need 6 tuners if we're only going to need to tune 4 strings. And you can see right there, 1, 2, 3, 4. And they even have kind of that same setup as the guitar where the top one is a little bit bigger and it's going to make a lower sound. The bottom one is going to make a higher sound because it's smaller, okay? We also have the bridge, and even better than on the guitar, you can see how the strings are kind of held up above the neck so that they'll vibrate, they'll shake back and forth real fast, and they'll make that sound, okay? Now, when you first start learning the violin, you are going to learn to play it pizzicato, and that's our fancy Italian word for plucking with the finger, and it kind of sounds like this. It's really good for learning where to put your fingers and just kind of getting the feel of the instrument. But of course, when you get a little further on, you are going to want to play with one of these. This is the bow that goes with the violin, okay? And it's made of 2 parts. It's made of wood, and this part right here is actually made of horsehair. Now, whenever we go over this in class, I always have some concerned students who are worried that the horse gets hurt. It doesn't. It's like getting a haircut. You take a little bit off the tail, and it grows right back, I promise you. Thing is, horsehair is really not that different than your hair or my hair. And if I were to rub my head on the violin, it doesn't really do much. It doesn't make a sound. It just kind of slips and slides across my hair. And that's what would happen with a brand new bow. So we need to do something to it. Your violin would typically come with something that looks like this. This is called rosin. And it basically makes the bow hair sticky. Not sticky like, a lollipop that you, took out of your mouth and now it's got all kinds of gunk stuck to it. That would be kind of gross to play an instrument with. Instead, it almost kind of leaves a chalk-like powder when you rub it on the hair of your bow. and it helps that bow hair grab onto the strings and make it vibrate. And you get a pretty different sound than what happened when we simply plucked the strings. Now when we play long, smooth bow strokes like that, we call it legato, okay? Another fancy schmancy word, but it's basically long, full sounds that the violin is kind of well known for. You would hear a lot of that inside the orchestra. You can also play something called staccato. That's when we would play shorter notes. Not quite as pretty, but it's going to have its place in some songs, okay? And there's another one that usually beginning violinists don't learn, but it's kind of fun because what you do is you bounce your bow off the strings. It's called spiccato. Okay? And a violinist will typically play in one style at a time, but they need to learn how to switch back and forth between all those styles. I'm going to play a song for you guys, and you wouldn't really see a violinist in an orchestra switch this often, but hey, we don't have all day. So we're going to start with pizzicato, but I'm going to keep the bow in my hand so that I'm able to switch. Alrighty, and I've got one more instrument to show you today. So we're skipping over two because, again, we don't have all day. The viola is probably the instrument that is, the most likely instrument you've never heard of. A viola is basically just a very, very slightly bigger violin. It's so close to the violin, in fact, that if I had just played the viola for 5 minutes, you would probably think I had the violin. Because viola is just a little bit bigger, violin you saw is about this size, viola would be like out to here. Not much bigger, but it does have bigger strings and it does make lower sounds, okay? Then we have the cello, and for the cello, you have to imagine that the violin grew a little bit. Instead of standing like 1.5 feet tall, it's now closer to 3 or 4 feet tall. You have to sit down, you lean it against you, and because it's now significantly bigger than the violin and the viola, it's going to make much lower sounds. But the lowest pitched instrument of all is this fella right here. This is called the bass, and it is pretty much tied with the tuba and the piano for the lowest sounding instrument in the entire orchestra, okay? If we hold up real close, you can see these strings are gigantic, and they make super low sounds. Just like the violin, we've got our body, we've got our neck, we've got our head with the fancy scroll, we've got tuners, and we've even got a pretty colossal bridge down there, okay? The bass is so big that we ask the people who play it to play it standing up. If I sit down right now, I'm not going to be tall enough to play it. So I set this thing up so that where the strings go onto the head should be about even with my forehead, and I set it up beforehand to make sure that was just right so you didn't have to sit through 2 minutes of me messing with it. The bass is played mostly with the bow, just like the violin, but the bass actually has kind of a nicer sound when you play it pizzicato. So I'm going to play pizzicato for you, and there's two things you can do on this instrument that you can't really do on an electric bass or an electric guitar. One of those things is called vibrato, and that's, you're going to see my hand kind of shake back and forth, and you're going to hear the sound move with it. The other kind of cool thing is you can do a slide, and that's when we go from a lower note to a higher note, and you can go back again. You can actually slide from a low to a high as well, but a slide will sound kind of like this. and it just gives it kind of a cool effect. So I'm going to play you guys an older song. It's called Nature Boy, that uses all that stuff and is played pizzicato. All right, but of course you want to see the bow in action. And the bow for the bass is not really any longer than the one for the violin, but it is thicker because the strings are so much bigger that you're going to need kind of a tougher bow so it doesn't, accidentally break in half or something like that, okay? So I'm going to adjust you guys just a little bit, hopefully not drop you, so you can see the bow. Or not. Okay. So the bowing on the bass is going to sound kind of like this. And even though it's not the world's best sound on its own, it adds such a nice low end to an orchestral piece of music, like this one. And my absolute favorite song to play on this instrument is also probably one of the easiest because we're only going to get 2 different notes, okay? So we're going to go get our open lowest string, and then we're going to go one tiny little pitch above that. All right, if you don't know that one, that's the Jaws theme. So just imagine, a shark kind of sneaking up on you with that music in the background. All right, guys, I'm going to leave you with that. Next time, I'm going to put up a video about percussion instruments. There's a lot to talk about with percussion because there are so many percussion instruments. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed strings because I absolutely love playing these instruments and talking about them. I will see you next week. Take it easy.